For my aesthetic expression, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the job that I had before I decided to switch my career to PT. I worked for a large investment firm in a specialized department called the Inheritor Services Group. What we did is when someone passed away, we would help transition the money or the bonds or the stocks in the investment account into either the beneficiary's accounts or into their estate or trust account. A lot of people were intimidated to work in this group because it dealt with death, and sometimes that was hard, but I also got to experience people on a whole new level. And I just wanted to share some of the stories about the phone calls I took while I worked there. One day, a woman called in about her husband of 65 years who passed away. You could sense the panic and worry in her voice when she asked questions about the account. After we spoke and got her questions answered, she said she was sorry. She had never dealt with their finances in her life. She sounded scared and overwhelmed. I suggested she reach out to a family member who might be able to help her, or to speak to one of our financial advisors who might be able to educate her on the different assets she and her husband had owned. I transferred the call, and that was the last time I spoke to her. A man called in once. His wife had passed away a while ago, at least 10 years. She had an account at the investment company that had been sitting there all this time because no one knew that the account existed. Part of our job is to try and reach out to the next of kin after a certain amount of time, and if no one can be reached, the money will be claimed by the state. So we sent the letter, and he called in, and I was the one who answered the phone. He was kind, and he told me about his wife, how much he missed her, and how his life had taken a turn for the worst, financially speaking, since her passing. Comes to find, his wife had left $100,000 in her retirement account that was rightfully his as the spouse. For legal reasons, I couldn't tell him over the phone until he had sent in the necessary paperwork to prove he was who he said he was. But I remember I called him on the day to let him know that the transfer of assets had gone through, and he began to cry. He was overwhelmed with gratitude, and he told me his life had been forever changed and that he'd never forget me. I don't feel like I did much, but that was a great phone call. An elderly gentleman called in one day, and I happened to be the one to get the call. Our department had sent him a packet of paperwork to fill out to begin the inheritance process after his wife had passed. He seemed really confused and wasn't sure why we had mailed him anything in the first place. As he was talking, I looked at the notes on his account. Turns out he had been calling us for a few weeks. Each time he called in, he was confused and he didn't know why we kept mailing him anything. He just kept throwing it away. It seems that none of the other representatives wanted to work the case, so they would simply remail him a packet, enter a quick note into the case, and then get off the phone with him. I gave this man my personal extension so he could reach out to me directly when he got his new packet of paperwork, which I mailed to him rush order. I told him I would walk him through the paperwork over the phone. No problem. Just dial my extension. He thanked me, and we ended the call. After a few days, I called the man up. He didn't remember me. I tried to call again the next day, and the same thing happened. He wasn't sure why I kept bugging him about some forms that needed to be filled out. He eventually stopped returning my calls. Once I picked up the phone to a woman who was just screaming at me. At first, I couldn't even understand what she wanted because she was so upset. Her anger was palpable, and it made my stomach turn to knots to be screamed at like that. We were told to hang up the phone if customers become abusive, but I wanted to try and help. I read in the note on her profile that her mother had just died and she was the appointed executor of her mom's will. Turns out she was looking for a tax document for her mom's IRA account. The tax document she was looking for didn't exist, but she wouldn't stop yelling enough for me to explain that to her. I eventually had to end the call, having accomplished nothing. I asked our back office to make an exception by sending her a letter explaining that the tax document didn't exist and she wouldn't need it for the beneficiary process. I hope that helped her. Occasionally, someone will spend the majority of the call crying. We were trained to deal with this type of reaction, especially in our department, but you never really know how to help when all you have is your voice. You learn to talk them through their emotions and let them feel heard, while also gently trying to get them to fill their paperwork out. It's a delicate balance between productivity and compassion. You learn that the best way that you can help someone is to be good at your job. During my time at Inheritor Services Group, clients would call in for simple requests, but sometimes they liked to stay on the phone to chat. They would tell me about their day and what the weather was like in whatever state they lived in, or how their children and grandchildren were doing. Oftentimes, these people lived alone after their spouse had died, and sometimes their children lived really far away. These were the best conversations I had, learning about other people in faraway places. We were always told to keep our calls short, get in, get out, because all of our phone time metrics were recorded, reviewed, and critiqued monthly. I learned to ignore those rules sometimes. I spoke to many lawyers over the years that I worked at the investment firm. They could be especially hard to reason with at times, but they never wanted to stay on the phone long. In those cases, I would spend hours of my time scouring the will or trust documents to advise the lawyers on next steps or what required paperwork we needed. Usually, it was a dispute between siblings over who was supposed to inherit what. You came to see how quickly those family bonds can crumble once money becomes involved. Sometimes speaking to a lawyer meant something more sinister, like domestic violence, that ended in murder suicide. At this job, I looked at hundreds of death certificates, but looking at a death certificate labeled homicide was always jarring. But the hardest phone calls by far were from parents. One father called in to me. His 12-year-old son had just passed away. They had a 529 education fund in his name that he would now never be able to use. His father was calm and solemn, and he never cried. I didn't ask how his son died, and he didn't offer. Sometimes you're not sure if you're overstepping your bounds, and because our phone calls were recorded and reviewed, it was best to be professional and follow his lead. We only spoke a couple times. I helped transfer the assets into his other child's college fund account. Working for the Inheritor Services Group has taught me a lot. I learned how to connect with people, comfort them in times when they felt hopeless, and appreciate where someone is in their grieving process. You could really see all the layers to a person in a job like this. The position also taught me to appreciate life, my family, and my health. Because nothing is permanent, things will always change, and we are guaranteed nothing in life. These are lessons I will carry with me as a healthcare professional.